Hi, my name is Ivone Alexandre. I'm a game and experience designer that works in new technologies. And as you can see, we're discussing history in the humanities and game design, but I'm specifically bringing up experience design because it's what we usually use, the term we use when we're dealing with theme parks and real spaces. More specifically, though, I specialize in open world narrative and interaction design. And if that sounds a little confusing, it is. It's incredibly hard to explain, so kudos for letting me talk here. Recently, after many years of hearing me tell stories about what I do, my dad called me and sat me down and said, "So what is it exactly that you do?" And initially, I tried to explain by focusing on what I had done and reminding him what I had done. So I've worked in theme parks, Disneyland and Meow, large-scale events, and essentially built real space interactions for people. I've worked in interactive toys, having kids feel like they're Iron Man or the Hulk, and having toys that interact with all the toys in their room. And I've also done chatbots, which are robots that can talk to you and make you fall in love or make you solve mysteries. I've also worked in, when I say new technologies, I've worked in AR and VR. Augmented reality is, think Pokemon Go, where through a camera you can see the world, but there's digital overlays. And I've also worked in virtual reality, which is the full, you put on a whole headset and we put you in a fully digital space. I've also worked in ARGs, which are alternate reality games. We refer to these games as alternate reality because in most cases, when you're playing a game, the game announces it's a game. Alternate reality games blur the line between the two. So when you get your letter in the mail that says you're a spy in 1985, we don't tell you it's a game, even if you know it's a game. And mobile games and apps as well that connect you to these worlds. And after explaining all of that to my dad, he still said, "Yeah, but like, what do you do?" And so it was a little bit of a crisis of self, where I started asking myself the question, like, am I an author? Do I write? I do not code. I do not script. I do write. I do story tell, kind of. And he ended up saying something to me that has stayed with me now, which he said, "But I thought you wanted to be a writer. I thought you wanted to be a storyteller specifically." And I am kind of. I definitely write a lot, and I construct a lot of stories. But when we try and apply the concept of authorship, like the typical understanding of the relationship between author and reader or creator and viewer, the way you would do with a book or a movie, it doesn't work the same in game design. Those roles fundamentally begin to change in a really literal way. And that's what we're here to talk about, is the concept of authorship and fundamentally who tells the stories that we remember. So the first question is, what is an author? Which seems like an easy question, but it's really not. If we think about history as the stories of our past and the humanities as the stories of who we are, one of the first fundamental questions we ask is, who is telling the story? Who is relaying these events or these things? And historically speaking, at least in the last few hundred years, something that is created is assumed to have an author. Somebody wrote it. Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet. James Baldwin wrote Notes of a Native Son. Even other works of art have creators. Michelangelo is the creator of David. But that actually hasn't always been the case. Like so many things, authorship itself is a social construct. There was a time where we socially defined the idea of the author as a collective or participatory action. It wasn't important to acknowledge the person that wrote it down specifically, like this book or this story belongs to this person. It was more of a diffusion of thought. It's like the people that were writing things down were more of an authority, not necessarily an originator. Like, I write this book and this is mine. And as Foucault points out in his essay, What is an Author? Within many civilizations, as we know, there was a time when stories, folktales, epics, all of those things were circulated without a question of author. They were passed down, they're oral traditions. They were not representative of what we've come to kind of understand, like the sole brilliant genius that created the piece of art themselves. It actually wasn't until the 17th and 18th centuries that the idea of the solitary brilliant genius as creator started to emerge, presumably because of the question of ownership. If you want to buy and sell a story, you have to attribute it to someone. And so if someone wants to make money off of a play or a book, they need to say, this was by Tarantino, this was by Shakespeare. So by creating the concept of an author and those systems, you can also start to gatekeep the practice of storytelling and decide who you want to censor or who you want telling the stories. So when we conceptualize an author as the origin we accept the fact that an author or a small group of people are defining or dictating the stories that define us. At a time when we as a country are discussing things like critical race theory and tackling very real issues with how we're told stories of our past and who we are, it's really important to acknowledge that who is speaking matters. And even without delving into game design yet, we can actually see the world that Foucault talks about, where he says, back in the day, there wasn't ownership over story. Everybody collectively participated in the act of storytelling. And with things like TikTok and YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, the access to technology means that anybody can telegraph their messages or their stories to anyone across the world in seconds. Like a meme may come from somewhere, but no one really knows where. It becomes essentially a collective story. Authors, we got that. So you might ask, what does this have to do with game design? Well, games, especially the types that I specialize in designing, open worlds, they are systems in a similar way that TikTok and Facebook and social media are. We create rules and tools and goals within a system, and it allows people to essentially explore and create and tell their own story. And this process as a whole challenges the relationship between author and reader, or author and, they're not really reading a video game, it's author and reader, or author and receiver, author and player. It starts to break that down, because when you look at a video game, you can say somebody made it, but are they really telling the stories that are inside of it when the players are inside of it? So game design is fundamentally making literal the relationship between author and reader. So now we're going to take a look at some of the ways that we do this in game and experience design by breaking a story. So I'm going to start with a story that we all know, which is Little Red Riding Hood. Now, even though various versions of this story exist, we can agree on a few key consistencies. There's Little Red Riding Hood, there's a grandmother in a cottage, there's a wolf, and there's a hunter nearby. If we were to tell or diagram this story, it might look something like this. A young girl is dressed in red, is walking through the forest with a basket of food to go to her grandmother. She encounters a wolf. The wolf finds out she's going to visit her grandmother and suggests that she goes and picks flowers. The wolf goes to Grandma's house. Red Riding Hood shows up. They both get eaten. And then depending on your ending, a hunter shows up, kills the wolf, and Little Red Riding Hood and Grandma pop out of the wolf undigested. As you can see, when you lay it out this way in a line, where the events are told from beginning to end, one after the other, we call this linear storytelling. And this is the default way that we tell stories that involve events over time. We tell the story from beginning to end, including the events and the elements that are most important to our theme or our perspective. And interestingly enough, we can already interrogate the authorship of Little Red Riding Hood even before turning it into a game, because myths and fables passed down over centuries change over time. These types of arguments and conversations about who's the author and where it came from have been going on for quite a while. For example, Little Red Riding Hood is generally associated with the 17th century, but there's evidence that it goes as far back as the 10th. And there's some pretty fun variations. There's one where there's no hunter and the wolf just eats Grandma and Little Red Riding Hood as a moral tale. There's another one where the wolf was actually a werewolf. It was a more macabre. There's one where Red actually escapes, and there's one where she escapes, but then the wolf catches up and eats her anyway. So out of all these pretty fun variations, even before we get into games, we start to see that stories and identifying authorship could be seen as a questionable practice, because does the author get credit for the arrangement of words, for changing the flow of the story? Do they get credit for simply writing it down? And if you were to amend it for your child for a bedtime story, have you created a new version of Little Red Riding Hood? Are you a part of the web of Little Red Riding Hoods that exist in the world? We're going to make it even more complicated, though. If we set about turning this into a game, the first question that we're going to ask ourselves is, who is the player? So given that Little Red Riding Hood is our main character, it seems pretty obvious. Now, you could have a player play the wolf or grandma or hunter, and regardless of the story role, whether they're playing Little Red Riding Hood or not, as soon as you have a player inside of the space, that player is the main character, and everything happens with reference to them. First, before we add the player, you'll notice this looks a little bit different from the linear arc that we had. That was telling a story over time. Because we're adding a player that's going to move in a space, we have to take all those elements we talked about and essentially put it into a map format. So I've taken all the elements we already talked about. There's a wolf, there's Little Red Riding Hood, there's a hunter, there are flowers to pick, and there's Grandma in the cottage. When the narrative is broken into pieces like this and not in a line, where a player will move through the space and encounter different things in different orders, we call that procedural narrative. And the best way to think about this is Disney. Anybody who's seen a Disney movie knows the story, went through the emotions of The Lion King or The Little Mermaid. But then when you go to Disney, you notice you're not really experiencing the movie from beginning to end, right? They've taken elements from the movies and they've mapped them out to the entire space. So you'll see Cinderella's castle, or you'll see Jasmine walking in the street. And if you ever listen to children in those spaces, they're great story. They can catch everything, and they're great emergent storytellers, because they're like, I saw Cinderella and I saw the castle, and they recognize all these elements and attach them to the emotions that they experienced in the linear story. Now, creating the game space doesn't necessarily remove linearity. I do want to go through an exercise of, we could have the player go through this map in the same fashion as the story. If I put up borders so that there's no way to go to any outside roads, it goes straight to the cottage, and I block the path and make Red Riding Hood start walking straight, think of it like kind of like at a ride at Disneyland. Once you get on, you're on that thing and you're just going to keep going in the same direction. If we force her to go in one direction, we can also dictate when she talks to the wolf. We could also force the player to pick flowers while obviously the wolf goes after grandma. And everybody ends up pretty much at the same spot that they would have if we were telling the linear story. And there are wonderful games out there that are linear, that players are carried through an experience. It's not mutually exclusive from games design. It's similar to the way we experience movies. You're carried along. The author can control the pacing, the flow, and the emotion of what's going on. So you're fundamentally controlling what the player does and when they do it in order to control that. But in order to do the type of design that I specialize in, we have to give a little bit more agency. Agency is the degree to which a player is able to cause significant change in the game world. So high agency means a player is making a lot of choices and creating significant change to what happens to them inside of the game. Low agency is more akin to what I just described. You're going on a route, everything's predetermined on what you're going to experience. So what happens when we start to add agency? So let's take a look at our game space again and remove the limitations and the borders. Now she's free to take any path and traverse even the forest itself. We're going to say she can move in any direction. So for example, instead of going right at the bend, she could go straight, and she could encounter the hunter first. And the hunter sees her and is very concerned and escorts her to the cottage, never encountering the wolf. Not as much of a moral tale. We could also, maybe she doesn't listen to her mother, who told her to stay on the path, and she goes straight to the forest, startling the wolf, and gets immediately eaten. That's another version of the story. So when a player can carve out their own path and choose their own action in whichever order, you're going to start seeing the versions of stories start to multiply. You're asking a question like, well, what happens if I go here? And what happens if I go here? A good way to think about this is the old Choose Your Own Adventure books. It's like, as soon as you do this, then instead of only having one story, we start to see it multiply. When a player has this type of agency to kind of explore in any order and take action, we call it open world. So an open world game, or we call them sandbox games as well, is one in which you can explore a virtual world or a real space and explore objectives and activities freely. So we already talked about Disney being an open world because nobody really controls where you go or in what order you see things. But as soon as you're on a ride, it goes back to being linear. As soon as we give the player agency, the question of authorship already starts to crumble. Think back to a few minutes ago, before I had Red Riding Hood do anything. There was a lot of potential things that could happen. I had created a space and what a player can do, but no story had really been told yet because there was no player actually walking through the space, or there was no example to be observed. And I kind of think it's the narrative version of the tree in the forest with no one around to hear it. If you create all the potentials for these stories in a space and there's no one there to walk through it, what have you really created at that point? So when a player says, the wolf ate me, or I befriended a hunter, or I picked the most beautiful flowers, if you think of me as the author, I didn't write those lines and I didn't write those stories. You can think of it as I created the potential for those stories. Roland Barthes, a French literary theorist, writes in an essay called The Death of the Author about Mallarmé, who says that ultimately it is the language which speaks, not the author. The language itself acts, not the self. And he goes on to say that we know that a text does not consist of a line of words releasing a single message. that it's about the tissue of citations resulting from 1,000 sources of a culture. This is the reason why two people can read the exact same thing, the exact same line, and interpret incredible amounts of meanings from them in their own mind. So an author can write the line, but they don't necessarily tell the story. And in game design, with these examples, you can start to see that games make that relationship real. We can create the potential for what you experience, but we can't necessarily control the story that you tell afterward. And even considering the fact that we use the term coding language, I find that these literary theorists would have loved game design if they were around today, because we use the term language when we refer to code. And when Barthes says that the line acts, it isn't the author, you can make the same case for software engineering. So when we're using our languages, an argument can be made that we're creating the potential, not the stories themselves. And there's also an interesting thing to look at, where I gave 4 examples of what different players could experience in a game. But a lot of times you can replay a game. Replayability of I'm going to play the game multiple times and I'm going to see how many stories I can find. And it's interesting to ask the question, does that give us a better understanding of the game as a whole? Because we're seeing more of the possibilities? Probably. Does it make the author more real because we're seeing the entirety of their intent? Maybe. It reminds me of, this is a very often quoted Michelangelo idea of the statue being, or the sculpture being inside of the marble. The sculpture is already complete within the marble block before I even start my work. And it reminds me of this because in this case, it's not really the creator that's doing the sculpting. If you think about it in these examples where somebody would play a game over and over again to get these different stories and essentially get a map of all the intentions that the author may have had, essentially the chiseling is being done by the player. The block was created by the author. And that leads us very nicely into talking about this concept and taking it further, because to chisel, a player needs tools. So what if we give Red tools? Up until now, we've assumed that Little Red Riding Hood can only do things that allow her to move through the story. She can walk, she can talk, she can pick flowers. But let's give her a little bit more agency in the space. Red Riding Hood goes for blood. I initially put this in as a joke, but it's actually worth noting, just for a pause, that one of the easiest and most understandable ways to create agency in a space and very easy to understand win and lose conditions is combat, which is why you see combat in so many different games. It's more of ease rather than a preference for violence. But I do think we should stay a little bit more on message. So we're going to talk about a game from 2009 called Scribblenauts. So Scribblenauts was a game where players were a character that had different puzzles to solve to traverse a world. And in order to solve those puzzles, they could literally type in anything they could imagine, and that thing would come to life. And so if you came up to a tree that had an apple in it, you could type ladder to climb up to the ladder, or you could type giraffe and the giraffe would eat the apple. And so there's all these different ways for you to solve different problems. So let's assume that we're going to give Little Red Riding Hood a similar ability, that she's an aspiring artist, and anything that she draws in her notebook in her basket comes to life. We're going to make it 17th century solutions because we're not going to be dealing in rocket ships for this one. But let's take a look at our map again and create some new situations. With this new ability in our game, she has a lot more choices as to what she can do in order to get to Grandma's cottage. So maybe she creates a green cloak to blend herself into the flower patch and hide from the wolf. Or she runs into the forest, draws a giant tree, puts a ladder so she can get away from the wolf, and then gets a parachute to parachute over to Grandma's house. Or she creates a hole when she hears rustling in the brush, but it turns out to be the hunter and she accidentally traps the hunter in the hole. This is a bit of an oversimplification because these types of games are pretty difficult to design. It takes a lot of work to both create the possibilities for the different things you can use, as well as the relationships between them. But some very interesting things begin to happen when we think about authorship. First, remember in the beginning when we only had the elements we knew, Grandma, the wolf, Red Riding Hood, and the hunter, and we moved through it. Now, I'm adding back the elements that were created by the player. So they created a parachute and a ladder and a tree and a hole. These are new elements that are added to the game space, creating new behaviors and physical things that we as the authors of the space didn't necessarily prescribe. We may create possibility, but we don't create exactly how it's used. We don't prescribe exactly what you're supposed to do, so it's not scripted. So the contributions to literally the shape of the story and the elements within the world, they come directly from the player. So if we look back at our linear trajectories, originally they were black lines because it was a bunch of elements we knew and somebody moving through it. But now, if you think about it, we've added blue spaces because the player is literally adding new things to the story. And so you're not just walking through the space we created, they are also adapting the space to what they need and to what they're doing. But there's something even more interesting that happens. Let's say that we never planned for a bridge. We didn't design a bridge into the space, but a very clever player decided to draw a bunch of boxes and a bunch of ladders and construct them to create a bridge from where Little Red Riding Hood is all the way to the cottage and never interacts with any of the other play space, just gets the win condition of, I made it. This is an unanticipated action taken by a player that a designer did not necessarily foresee. And when this happens, we call it emergence. I love this definition because it doesn't really say what emergence is because it's a very complicated thing to describe. Essentially, emergence is the behaviors and stories that emerge from players that designers cannot anticipate. The best way to think about emergence is cheaters and children. Cheaters bypass or manipulate the rules of a game to gain a specific outcome. We can anticipate cheaters for sure, and we definitely try and deter it, but ultimately their behavior is emergent because they're acknowledging the rules of the space and they're finding ways to create new behaviors inside of it. And while cheating may seem generally like a bad thing, if you have people cheating in your system, it means they care enough about the rules in the system to want to cheat. It takes effort to cheat. When I worked at Meow, we had a situation where we had created a real space with a bunch of different patterns that you had to find in order to put them into a machine and visit a virtual world. Each pattern was like dialing into a new space in VR. And they were all hidden, and there were puzzles everywhere in order to get those patterns. When we ran tests, one person realized that the point was to collect patterns. We did not telegraph the goal. We didn't say, hey, you're finding patterns. We just hid things inside of puzzles. When this particular person realized that you were collecting patterns, they didn't care about the puzzles. They started going around to other players asking them for their patterns. And they were the only player to find every pattern. They didn't play the game the way it was supposed to be played. They went around and figured out another way to get the information. And I remember in the Q&A, they apologized, and I said, no, you're my favorite player because you cared enough, you realized what was happening, and you cared enough to go get them, and you ended up finding everything. In a way, you're one of the best players because you got to see all the wonderful content that we wanted to show you. Children as well are the best emergent storytellers because everyone knows that if you give a child a toy, they're not necessarily going to use it the way that the toy was intended. If you give a kid a Barbie, they might use it as a spoon because they have nothing else to stir a pot with. These types of patterns means that we're giving people the elements that they need or the tools they need to tell stories, and they get to decide what they do with them. They get to decide their behaviors. The best example that people will probably recognize for this type of emergence sandbox type of game is Minecraft. The game is generally described as online Lego. It involves building blocks and creating structures across different environments, and you can gather resources, you can craft items, you can build things, and you can do combat. But there's no objective to Minecraft. It's a space where you're given a lot of different items and a lot of different relationships, and you get to express yourself and do whatever you want, really. And there have been some incredible things built inside of Minecraft that the designer had no way of knowing people would do. People have built King's Landing from Game of Thrones. They've built a space shuttle that takes off, and they've even built a functioning computer. When we get into this level of gameplay, we're not really authoring at this point. If we provide a sandbox and players go around and create cell phone towers and phones within the game, that stops belonging to any one author. It belongs to the player, and it belongs to everybody else in that game. Much like Barthé Foucault also didn't see writing or authorship as a handing over of literal ideas, it was a jumping off point. I love this quote because he literally said, writing unfolds like a game, then inevitably moves beyond its own rules and finally leaves them behind. He goes on to describe the kinship between writing and death, that like in the development of classic Greek narratives or epics was to have heroes that accepted an early death but remained immortal in their death. Ultimately, he describes the written narrative as a protection against death, and with a right to murder its author. And it's a lot of violent metaphors, but it's appropriate. When you think about games, it works almost too perfectly, because even with a game like Pong, something that isn't combat, we don't say, I lost. We don't have a tendency to say, I lost. We have a tendency to say, I died, which is to say that every time we play a round or a session of something, we are playing a life. We are existing in a space and defining our own existence within that world. So while the system itself provides the structure for life, it doesn't define what the story is inside of it. And we can take it one step further. What if we connect more people to this? So up until this point, we've assumed a single person playing and the world responding to them. But what if we add more people or more points of agency? So going back to our Red Riding Hood example, let's say we could play one of these 4 roles. I would personally choose the grandmother with the rolling pin, but that's just me. So if we were to create rules and goals for each of these roles, like one player can play Little Red Riding Hood, she can't fight, but she can hide. Multiple players can play wolves, that their goal is to try and eat grandmother and Red Riding Hood. Multiple players can play hunters, which is to stop that, and grandmother's goal is to hit the wolf over the head with the rolling pin. As soon as we do that, they now all have agency. We've created a system that gives them goals and agency, and after that, it's entirely up to them in how they solve the goal. And this is what we generally call multiplayer, competitive, or cooperative online gaming. Because there are multiple people with their own agencies and strategies, no match is played exactly the same way twice. In fact, if we try and calculate, we did our first version that was you saw a branching narrative. We did our second version where it increased exponentially with the creation of items in the space. Now it's infinite. Think of it like sports. How many times have we watched a baseball game or a basketball game? It has the same rules. It can even have the same players, the same teams, and the same weather on a particular day. But no game of basketball or baseball or football is ever exactly the same as another one. So we've truly reached an infinite amount of things that can be, or infinite amount of stories that can be told in that space. The best example of this is Fortnite, which I'm sure everybody's heard about. It has all of these elements. A player drops onto an island with the agency to collect weapons and fight. They can literally build structures to escape or protect themselves, and they're on this island with 99 other people, and the last man standing wins. There's no match of Fortnite that is going to be the same as any other one. So the authorship of these systems creates potential for all of these things, but it isn't the expression of the author. It is the involvement of the players, readers, and interpreters that create the meaning. In Borges' short story, Everything and Nothing, he writes of Shakespeare contending with what he is at the end of his life. And God says, I dreamed the world the way you dreamt your plays, dear Shakespeare. You are one of the shapes of my dreams. Like me, you are everything and nothing. And so the authorship of video games is creating the everything for people to be inside of and experience all of these wonderful things. But ultimately, they are nothing because as soon as that's created and experienced, the author disappears. So we've been over the 3 things that we do in game design to transfer authorship as much as we can to players. And in an open world system, I prefer this form of design because it allows people to discover. It gives them the ability to carve out their own space and their own roles. And I wanted to take a moment and mention implicit bias in the authorship of systems. We talked about critical race theory at the open of the lecture, highlighting that who gets to tell our stories and how they're told are really important. I've been speaking very enthusiastically and optimistically about the disappearance of the author and how we can provide this way for all of these people to tell stories, and it feels very democratic and all of that, but it doesn't mean that there isn't still bias in how we develop these systems. Who gets to author these systems is just as important, if not more important than classic forms of storytelling. Because when we design things like this, we're literally creating spaces where people experience other lives. And just like in real life, we absorb all the information around us all the time. As a simple example, in a scene in Call of Duty that took place in Pakistan, they actually had Arabic writing on the wall. And people in Pakistan don't speak Arabic, they speak Urdu and English. But to anybody playing that game, you've sent a message that people are not going to consciously recognize, but you've created bias. You've created a narrative that's going to be reinforced. If we have implicit bias in the real world, and then we create worlds for other people to be in, those biases are going to transfer. So while I can poetically and theoretically disappear as an author, we have a lot of responsibility to advocate for the access to these systems and to ensure that there are many voices creating them. After all that, and much thinking, I did eventually tell my dad something like this to answer the question of what it is that I do. Using open world systems and environments, we design the potential stories that players discover, create, and tell afterward. And he claims to get it, but I don't sometimes, so I'm gonna keep working on it. And I guess the question that he asked in the beginning, does that make me an author or storyteller? I'm not really sure. But I do know that if I am, that I'm the least important one. Thank you. So when I was a child, no, I'm kidding, for real though. No, so when I was a kid, the first job I ever wanted to do was, I wanted to be an astronaut. And the first presentation I ever gave in class, I gave on Venus. Like everybody had to pick a celestial body, and I picked Venus. And I didn't read the facts and figures about Venus. I designed it in 6th grade. I designed it I wrote it as a first person account, as if I was taking my class on a trip to Venus. So like I shook tables. I was like, we're taking off, the winds are too fast. And I incorporated facts about Venus into it. I don't actually know how fast the winds are anymore on Venus. Obviously didn't learn a lot, but it wasn't until later that I realized that I didn't want to be I thought astronauts looked more like sci-fi, where I would get to go to worlds and kind of explore them, right? And I think that what game design ultimately does is it does build worlds. The specific nature of open world, which I've described, is when the ego of linear, of saying, I want you to feel this right now, like I'm going to take you through a thing and I want you to feel this and I want you to feel this and I want you to feel this. It's more escapism, which is wonderful. It's a wonderful form of entertainment. It's like I'm taking you away and I'm going to trigger the emotions that you're going to experience. But that takes away how we actually tend to go through the world. And when you give the game over, when you give open worlds over to people, the things that they have to do to understand the story or to feel something are more about learning and discovery and curiosity, which are things that I think are incredibly important. And I've pulled away from the linear and some of the other more traditional styles of gaming because at a time when we're so in love with technology, it's taking us away from the world that we're in. And if we can create relationships and encourage behaviors like curiosity, which is fundamentally my favorite emotion, if we can be inspiring curiosity and discovery, I think, one, the things you experience stay with you more, and two, they're truer because they're things that you found on your own. They're things that are now related to you. When I worked on the Stranger Things game in particular, we did an AMA afterwards, and I asked, they got to ask me questions about the design. And there was one particular character that we had to, originally, the character had a much bigger storyline, and they were a trans character. I didn't telegraph they were a trans character, they were a trans character. And so I had to cut a lot of that content, but I still sprinkled little clues about that character into the game. And in the AMA, they all caught on. I don't know how. They knew that the character was special somehow. Or that, not that they were special, they knew that the character had a bigger story. And they were like, why is this character here? Tell me more about it. And I got to tell them, but they were so happy they were right. They were so happy with what they discovered. They wanted to see a spinoff with that character. And that type of encouragement makes more connections, I think, between people and the real world and can be carried into good behaviors in the real world versus the escapism of like, I'm just gonna go in and get adrenaline rushed and then leave and then come back to the real world without necessarily developing, honestly, emotional intelligence or connection to the world as it is. 100%. And it's actually interesting because there's an argument, there's an ongoing argument with emergent design versus linear design. People who do linear design say you can't inspire the same emotion with, or you can't inspire emotion with emergent design. And on the counter, it's like, I might not be able to inspire the exact same emotions you're talking about. I might not be able to inspire the Indiana Jones ride and seeing the snake. Like, I might not be able to do that. But I can tap into different emotions. Like I said, curiosity is one of the emotions, and curiosity is just as valid of emotion as excitement or anger or sadness, like these kind of deeper emotions. Curiosity is an emotion, it's just different. And I do think it's kind of like CG. You know, really good CG in movies enhances what's already there. You don't replace everything with it. And so if you're designing mechanics in an emergent space, you're not saying, like you mentioned, you're not saying, I'm going to put obstacles and all this stuff. You're saying, I'm going to enhance what human beings like to do in a space naturally, and I'm going to reward them for those behaviors in an interesting way. With the Marvel toy example, that was one of my first big jobs, and we had to run play tests. And running play tests with 6-year-olds is the most fun you'll ever have doing design, because they don't listen to anything, and they don't do anything like they're supposed to do them. And they don't absorb any of the story, and it's wonderful. This is not like similar. It's like I would never say that they play incorrectly. Just like you would. I remember we had a moment where we had one of the kids hold a Captain America shield and take a pledge from Captain America, and then fight a couple of robots and then leave. And I overheard the kid telling his mom what happened. She goes, so what happened? What'd you do? And he goes, I was with Iron Man and Cap. Not true. Iron Man was not there. I was with Iron Man and Cap. I was on a helicarrier. Also not true. And I thought all these, and so this story that he had in his mind was like, I remember walking like, that's emergent storytelling. Like, half of the stuff's not even true. But it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Yeah, it's an interesting space because, so there's two parts to that. So one is the more theoretical of, you do see the arrow generally points in the opposite direction, right? You have the linear stuff that gives you all the emotion, and then you break all the pieces and put it somewhere else. And it's actually very difficult, like we've talked about, to inspire emotion with the emergent. It's why we always say you have to have a brand attached. People already have to know something about what you're doing, because you can't, it's very hard to tell people, go be curious. Be curious right now. Like, that's a very hard, I can get you to be sad. I can take you to a haunted house and I can scare you, but I can't say be curious or discover new things. But you are seeing a trend, I think, with specifically having so much technology in our pockets and being able to like search for stuff and being able to do that. There is more of an inclination toward specific, it's usually still marketing tie-ins, like it's usually still stuff that's tied to IP, but you do see design over multiple platforms would be the best way to describe that, where, you know, even a movie poster, if you go to a movie poster these days, you'll like scan a QR code and it'll take you to a website that's in story, right? And you'll go to that website and then maybe there's like a phone number to call or something, and that's in story. So it's more like the way that people construct experiences, and again, marketing is the best example of this because they want people's attention, but I think the way that it's affecting how mostly traditional storytellers do it is just doing it on multiple platforms. It's like building a brand online. Like, you have a brand on TikTok, but then you also have a YouTube channel and you have that. It's more creating a network of things rather than you're only creating something on one platform. Oh, that's rough. That's a rough question. Because it doesn't exist. That's actually the scary part about this. It exists, but, you know, when you're doing a linear story, like we talk about, like I'm trying to create, you know, I have characters and there's events that I can put in order and emotions that I can tap into. With open world, it really is about exploration. So most of the ways that I get excited about these types of things is I'm a compulsive collector of things that nobody else would think to collect, I don't think. I collect postcards from the turn of the century that have been written already. I once found a box at a thrift store that was from a woman who worked at JPL. and it was all of her stuff. It looked like the box that she carried out when she got fired. And there's actually emails inside of the box about her getting fired. And it was just this very weird little ecosystem of stuff. And I don't have anything to do with that. But the ways that I find inspiration for this type of thing is to actually explore in the real world and be curious about everything. And just look at the ways that stories exist in a real space. Like even the tour of this house. You know, like everything, all of these spaces tell a story. And so I collect things and I compulsively explore places I'm not supposed to. That's pretty much what I do. Yes, there's a really intense example. I was actually going to talk about this in the talk, but I didn't. I thought it would be too much time. EVE Online is an online space simulation that has existed for 14 or 15 years at this point. I think it's existed for a while, and it's a space simulation. So they built a world where players can run corporations, create larger corporations that absorb other players. They can have bases, and they have giant ships, and people belong to factions. And so it's pretty much a science fiction movie made real, where players actually control quite a bit of what's going on. And in 2014, there were two large factions that were partnered in being the strongest corporation in EVE Online, and there was another corporation that was not as large, and they had a space open up on one of their bases. I think somebody forgot to pay a sovereignty payment, and so essentially what it did is it changed the state of the base. Like the bases themselves, they're not always open to being conquered because that would just create chaos. But because they failed to make that payment, that part of the base essentially opened up to be conquered. And they tried to patch it up without quietly, we gotta fix this. But the other side found out, and they teleported so many ships to that region and started an unplanned battle that lasted something like 21 hours. And I think at the end of the battle, they had destroyed, I think they're called Titans, they had destroyed massive ships, the kind of ships that don't blow up very often. It was $1 trillion in in-game currency damage, and it was 330,000 real dollars in 20 hours. And so this was at the time, I think they've now beaten the record, but at the time it was the largest video game event based on people involved. There is still a memorial, by the way, that exists in game, a persistent memorial with ships that are destroyed, and at the center is a memorial to this battle. And to take it one step further, there was a journalist that found out about this battle and wrote a book and talked to tons of players and essentially tracked the development of those corporations and what happened and all of that, and wrote a book. So there is a history book out there on a battle that happened in a video game. And that to me is just, a beautiful thing. That's the world we live in now. You gotta ask that one, because we almost got into a lot of trouble. So we designed, earlier in the presentation, I mentioned alternate reality games, which are games where we don't necessarily telegraph that it's a game, even though people understand it's a game. The line between the real and the game worlds really blend. And so there was an online game where you went in and you acted like a 1980s hacker, and you had to enter in commands to lead your team through a building. But leading up to that experience, they needed a lot more content. They needed stuff for players to do before the actual event. And so in the theme of a 1980s spy, we had to create a lot of content for them, and we didn't have a lot of time. And so instead of trying to invent things, because Stranger Things Season 3 had taken place in 1985, I started looking for weird things that happened in 1985 that I could reference, that would seem even tangentially related to the Stranger Things storyline, which was about, Russians and espionage and things like that. And so I found, for example, one of the things I found was that a nuclear scientist disappeared in Spain in 1985, and he was about to give a talk on the dangers of nuclear winter and climate change. And he was there for a weekend, and he disappeared, and to this day, nobody knows where he is. And that really happened. So in the game online, I started leaving these breadcrumbs to these events without a goal. They were red herrings. They never really led to anything. It was something to make it feel like the game was more real, that they had to investigate. So we're like, there was a scientist. We don't know his name. He disappeared in Spain. What's his name? And so we had all these lines, these puzzle lines for people to follow. Another one that we found, there was a nuclear silo that was being built in the 1980s. We referenced that. And so we had all these little events that we referenced inside of the game. So when the players got all of these clues, they started investigating, and they found the scientists, and they found these places, and they found all these, and they started inventing connections that don't exist. It's like the kid thing. Like, it's not true. Nothing is connected. And some of the emergent behavior that came out of, and again, going back to the authorship thing, like, all I did was write a few lines pointing to a couple of historical events. That's all I did. And people called nuclear silos thinking that it was part of the game. So they also crashed a Russian server, a Russian science server, because they were trying to find the paper that the scientist who disappeared had written. And they were trying to find somebody on a Discord server who spoke Russian, because they thought we may have put clues inside of a scientific paper in Russian. And so we had no way, because the game space was essentially the real world, and we didn't give them a goal. They just assumed every route was something. They just went in every different direction. And it was the only time we broke character is we had somebody from our team go into the Discord server and say, please don't call any phone numbers unless it explicitly states to call them. Please don't get us in trouble. And at the time when they said that, a couple of people on the Discord server said, oh, thank goodness they said that. We were about to drive across state lines to go knock on the door. And so that is the type. But again, think about the discovery and curiosity of that. When I did the AMA later, I actually had a bunch of the players send me some wonderful articles that they found because they were researching the scientists, stuff that I hadn't even found. They're like, we just thought you would think this is cool. And they started sending me all these wonderful things. So they were adding more to my understanding of a story that I didn't author. I just pointed at it. I pointed at it and said, this is really cool. So much excitement. Calm down.